Good morning. And I don't think I need to introduce Secretary Fox. I think many of you know him very well, and he's also a former mayor of a large city, the mayor of Charlotte, which makes us even bigger fans of his work. Secretary Fox, welcome back to Brookings.
Glad to be here, Amy.
Wonderful
Thank
to
you for
have
having me. Yeah.
And we've had a great discussion this morning about how we need to do a better job, both here in the U.S. and around the world, in making our transportation infrastructure built environment policies more people-centric. And yet there are so many barriers for doing that. And so I want to explore some of those themes with you this morning. But I want to start with a question about just your global experience, because this is a global project, a project between our program and the Global Economic Development Program here at Brookings. Have you done a lot of international travel?
I've done quite a bit, actually, Amy. Transportation is an international language, and whenever you go to another country and you see how they're using mobility, or practicing mobility is a better way to say it, you can actually learn a lot. So
Where have you been?
So we've gone to spent some time in Germany, the UK, India, Australia, Japan, Scandinavia, South America. I've been to both Brazil and to Argentina. So I've gotten a pretty good sample of what's around the world.
And what have you observed from those travels about what makes the U.S. system and policy strong, and what can we do better?
Well, I think it's fair to say, just on a comparative basis, that our transportation system is more mature than a lot of other countries' systems are. On the other hand, that gives us certain advantages because we don't have to worry as much on a day-to-day basis about building it out, even though there are things we still need to do. On the other hand, the other countries have the advantages of learning from our mistakes. And, for example, in Amsterdam, which now has a great bicycle culture, it wasn't always that way. Back in the 60s and before, they were very auto-centric, and they just made the decision to convert to a bicycle culture, and people bought into it, and now they're kind of known for it, and you'd never know they have cars. So I think there's a lot that we can learn about mobility from other places because everyone's being challenged by population explosions in the urban regions and the need to move people around better.
And so let's talk about the switch from mobility to accessibility.
Yes.
This program has been about the fact that our entire system is focused on movement, VMTs, cars, and less about the way people actually move about their day. You have made accessibility a priority for you at DOT. Tell us why, and tell us a little bit about the work you've done. And I think Ladders of Opportunity is sort of at the center of that.
Yeah. So, if you look at our system, we have, again, a very mature system, but we also have stacked into our system certain prejudices about certain geographic areas and so forth. And so you can go to many cities and you can look at where the freeways are lined up and you can see the evidence of what people thought about those areas. And in most cases, not that much. And you can look at our transit systems. And in transit, a lot of times the challenges we have are the stops that didn't get put in place. It's more of an issue of omission usually than commission necessarily. But these mobility challenges hit people every single day. If you live in a underserved area and your job is across town, like for example in Richmond, Virginia, where between the hours of 7:30 and 9:30, something like, I think it's like 24% of the people on the west side of Richmond are not served by transit, and most of the jobs are on the east side. So people are trying to figure out how to get from one place to another. So it affects, if you're poor in this country, it's an expensive thing to be poor. Transportation eats up a second highest amount of your wallet. everything's an aggravation. You have to take multiple transfers to get from one place to another. If your kid gets sick, you got to figure out a way to get to work, but also deal with a sick kid. So it's just, it's a miserable experience, and it doesn't have to be. As a country, if we build the intentionality around our system and try to help people more, then folks will have an easier time.
So then tell us about ladders of opportunity. What have you been doing to try to create now a much needed culture shift across the country this way?
So there's sort of an offense and a defense to it. On the offensive side, we've tried to do the things to help communities reimagine transportation as more accessible. So for example, you and others have done studies that show the challenges of income mobility in certain areas. And we picked 7 of the cities that were lowest performing in terms of, if you're poor, how easy is it to get into the middle class? We picked 7 of the lowest performers, and we did a pilot called Ladder Step. We asked the mayors of these cities to come up with a transportation project that they thought could make a difference. And those cities were like Indianapolis, Baltimore, Baton Rouge, Atlanta, Phoenix. I'm going to miss somebody, but I'm sorry. Anyway, we picked 7. They picked 7 projects, and we're working on them, and they're at various phases of coming into existence. But the whole idea is,
can you give us an example? Like, what's an example of a really good project that can help us move closer to accessing people?
So one example is in Indianapolis. There's a series of neighborhoods that are in sort of the southern part of the city. And the jobs are in the northern part of the region, not just the city, but even a little bit outside the city. So the mayor had the idea of putting a bus rapid transit line that would connect folks from that part to the northern part of the city, and that project is in development today. So we have lots of things like that we're doing. So part of it is like seeing is believing. So if we can get it on the ground, people see it, they become national examples. We've also done things like the Every Place Counts Design Challenge. We went to 4 areas. I got to go to Philadelphia to meet with some folks whose neighborhood had been carved up by a freeway, and they were sitting right next to the State Department of Transportation folks, and they were actually talking about how to reimagine that community. And so I think those types of experiences then begin to help the planning process be more informed by the range of choices. On the defensive side, we have Title VI is one of our most important tools to ensure fairness in the use of federal dollars in transportation. Our guidance on Title VI has not been updated for 40 years. We just updated it. And we're also trying to move to a more proactive position with our NEPA process so that we're not encouraging DOTs to decide what they want to do and then have public input, but to have that public input before the decisions are made. So we're trying to engage the public, and hopefully some of the offensive things we've done have created more of a conversation.
One of the things that was raised today and in the research is the importance of performance metrics. That the performance metrics in the system now make it really difficult to change our investment programs and investment approaches and who we collaborate with. It's focused on, how well you're doing in terms of repairs or VMTs and speed. If we focus more on access and people, affordability, opportunity, have you started to experiment with metrics?
Yeah, we have. We actually are still trying to figure out how you do measure the people impact of projects. We can measure the number of cars that go through an interchange. We can measure cost effectiveness of various projects using certain economic criteria. But what we tell engineers to build the system and make as many vehicles go through it as possible. But we also ought to be telling our engineers, you have to look at this project from a 360-degree perspective. How is it going to impact the communities that touch it? What are the plans to ensure good connectivity? I'll give you one real concrete example from my neck of the woods. I-77 in the downtown area of Charlotte, plowed through a historically African-American community right in the center of town. And today there's an overpass, and the overpass is like this dark, dim thing. And if you lived in the neighborhood, you wouldn't want to walk under that underpass because you'd have no idea what would happen to you if you did. And so the city, working with the state, has now put in a light fixture in there, and it looks more inviting. And you know, sometimes it's simple things like that. Sometimes it's more dramatic, where you might tunnel something that's over the landscape. But we have to start thinking about these things more holistically because, frankly, for cities and communities, land values have been depressed because of some of this building. Communities have been cut up because of this, and it's frankly, it's a little unnecessary. And I'll add one more thing to this, since I've got like 8 more days.
Keep going.
I said this at TRB the other day, but you know, one of the things that our country needs to think about in terms of performance metrics and economies and so forth is right now we are chronically underinvesting in our infrastructure, whether it's repair or new capacity. Everybody says it, everybody knows it. One thing we haven't had a real conversation about is what can we do without? And I happen to think that if we actually got rigorous about it and looked at our street grids, our east-west, north-south street grids in our cities, that there are some freeways that run in the interior of our cities where there's probably no traffic advantage to having the freeway there. And restoring the old street grid might actually be as efficient or more efficient than having that freeway running through it. And it has the added value of reconnecting communities.
It's so interesting because we've had that same conversation on the housing side. We so much reward new housing starts, and yet we don't spend as much time talking about redevelopment and renovation and the power of reuse. So I think it's really powerful to think about that. Speaking of 8 more days.
8 more days.
Let me transition and talk about your exit memo.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed it, and not because you're exiting, by the way, but because there are...
I was wondering. I was like, I don't know, man.
But because there are really great progress and a lot of more challenges to come. And as President Obama said last night, this is a really a step in a really long journey. And so in your memo, you talked about 3 priorities or things that we need to keep an eye out: funding, technology, and really who benefits, the access question. So we've already talked about access, so let me just talk about the other 2.
Sure.
There's no doubt how we pay for things is a constant question, particularly in an environment where not only is it thin at the federal level, but states and localities are really struggling. Tell me about, in the last, under your watch, what have you all been doing to help states and cities really find leverage or resources to pay for a wide array of infrastructure projects?
So the first and foremost thing that we did was something that's really hard to do, which was to build a national urgency behind getting a floor under us with transportation investment. And that was, we did several things. We went on a national bus tour twice. We hit 100 communities, 43 states. We went to places, they weren't just like Democratic centers of the universe. We went to like Janesville, Wisconsin, where Paul Ryan's from. We went to Kentucky and Louisville, where Leader McConnell is from. And so we wanted to make the case to everybody. And I think that was part of why Congress came back and passed the FAST Act, and President Obama signed it on December 4th, 2015, which now provides us at least a floor for the next several years in transportation funding. At the same time, both I and the President were interested in how we could leverage more public-private partnerships in transportation. There's a lot of conversation about that now. I'll just tell you, without editorializing too much, that I do think there is some room for more public-private partnerships in transportation. Do I think we can get 100% of the gap between where we are and where we need to be? No. But, is it 10%? Is it 15%? Maybe. And so we have consolidated our credit programs within one roof. We've created a Build America Bureau that now has an executive director, and it is going to make the process of moving through a public-private partnership much easier without compromising some of the things that many of us care about, which are like environmental aspects and so forth. But this is going to be very effective. So the infrastructure is there to do more. But on the larger question of funding and what the future is, we've got to deal with the political reality that people are paying for a bad transportation system today. And whether it's like having to buy new tires more frequently or using more fuel because the road systems are inefficient and you're stuck in traffic for a long time. I don't think unfortunately, it sometimes gets cast as a choice between paying more taxes and nothing. But the reality is most people are paying something for the inefficiency of the system today. The last thing I want to point out here is that you could put $5 trillion into the transportation system. But if we're buying the wrong stuff for the future that we're walking into, then we're still going to have a problem. And I've been arguing more for a demand-driven approach to transportation, where instead of presupposing that 80 cents on every highway trust fund dollar should go to roads, we ought to be much more flexible at the federal level and let states have more a say at how they split that. Put some of that money or some of the additional money we find into regions and into cities so that they can do things that the states may be slower at doing, but they need to do. So I just think we just need to have a reset on the policy side, and I hope that in the future the conversation isn't just about how much money and where it's coming from.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I marveled about this conversation earlier today about the fact that we do have a lot of infrastructure needs in our country. There's a huge conversation about financing in the form of it, but we don't talk enough about what are we paying, what is that funding for?
Yeah. And
are we structuring the finance to reflect the built environment we want? And how do we bridge those conversations more? Do you have advice about that? I think that's what you're saying, is how do you bring those two conversations together?
And I want to be very careful because I get asked sometimes, what would you like to continue doing if you had a few more years? And then somebody writes, Fox gives Chow advice on whatever. It's not what I'm doing. But I think you're asking a very important question, which is how do we have a broader conversation about the policy side? And I think, frankly, one of the things that I think needs to happen is that we need a coalition of mayors and governors thinking about this, because they're the ones on whom the responsibility is ultimately going to lie to reshuffle the deck. I also think the transportation community as such is kind of splintered. And so there's a road lobby, there's a transit lobby, there's a rail lobby, but they almost always are arguing their own case and not the case for the system. And the problem with that is that when they go to the Hill or they try to get something done, it's not going to be integrated. If our road systems are just being judged on roads and not being judged on overall mobility and access, then we probably won't get mobility and access. But if we actually, getting to your point on measures, we start measuring the things that we want, and we're more flexible about how we get there, then we have a chance to get the 21st century transportation system everybody wants.
Let's talk about, we've got 5 more minutes before we open up to questions, so please keep thinking about what you want to ask our secretary. Let's talk about the disruptive nature of technology. I think sometimes people outside of maybe autonomous vehicles aren't truly prepared for what is to come. Tell this group what you see coming down in terms of the role of technology and its impact on infrastructure in the built environment.
Well, I think, when I was a mayor, I used to say about water, which is another type of infrastructure, I used to say, if the faucet comes on and no one thinks about me, then I've done my job. And I think that's the way people think about transportation. And so we have the advantage in a mature transportation system, as many holes as we have in it, potholes included, we do have the advantage of not thinking about it as much. Now what's happening with technology is, I think, a wave of choices now coming in. And they kind of, right now they're kind of like superficial choices, like, do I drive? Do I get a ride share? Do I get a cab? You're thinking about it that way. In the future, though, we're going to have significant changes in personal mobility with the car, and it's going to have implications. Certainly, from our vantage point, safety is first and foremost, and so trying to put some shape around safety as a priority as this technology emerges is part of what we do, which is why we produce the first in the world national comprehensive autonomous vehicle policy that lays a framework for that. And it starts to answer questions like, for example, today you and I drive cars. We have to go to DMV, and everybody loves to go to DMV, I know. We go to DMV to get our license. Well, what if the software is driving the car? So who's going to license that? And what we've said is that to the extent the software is operating the vehicle, the federal government will evaluate that, and the states don't need to trouble themselves with that. But to the extent a human being is driving the car, you still need a license. So we do that. I think beyond that, though, there are other questions, which is, what is the future ownership of cars, period? To what extent are we going to want to own a car versus owning a service that gets us where we're going? A lot of people quote the statistic that cars are like idle like 95% of the time. So, do you want to put the investment into buying something that you're not using 95% of the time, or do you want to just buy what you use? That could transform things. And then the younger generation, coupled with the boomers, who are finding ways to live closer in, have the conveniences of being able to walk or bike places, how are they going to behave in this new world, and are their tastes going to change? I don't know that necessarily means a net decrease in auto sales, although it probably does. But maybe those sales are business-to-business sales and not business-to-consumer as much as they have been. So I think there's going to be a lot of disruption around here. And I also think that if we're smart and we figure out how to do what I said, which is to be more demand-driven, you're going to see much more transit activity in places like the Southeast, where I'm from, and the Western states where there's such population growth that's exploding. You should see more regional conversation about freight movements, and you're going to see trucks that are also taking advantage of autonomous technology. So there's a lot of things that I think are going to happen. They're going to really change things, and we need to also be focused on labor and the fact that this is going to also introduce some challenges with our workforce.
So one more question before we go to the audience.
Sure.
You all invested in the Smart City challenge and program, and Columbus was the lucky community for that initiative. What are you learning from Columbus? What are they doing to sort of be at the forefront of integrating this technology, and is access on their minds?
So one thing that we did with the Smart City Challenge was we actually put access in as one of the criteria, and that actually had some really important lessons that we drew just from the application process. Several cities, for example, including Columbus, came up with this idea of a single pay app or a function where if you're trying to get from here to your doctor's office and you've got to take a bus and then a train and then a ride share to get door to door, that you pay one time for that trip and it's all seamlessly put together for you. And I think you're going to see that happen in a lot of cities around the country and probably the world. The other thing that they did in Columbus that I thought was really compelling is Columbus has they have a 4 times the national rate of infant mortality. And it was an issue before the Smart City Challenge, and they were very aware of it. What they endeavor to do is to create an app where mom can get her doctor's appointment at the same time the trip is generated. And if the bus is late or something, the app automatically contacts the doctor's office and gets the appointment rescheduled. But they're thinking about how to connect people. And the last thing that Columbus did on the equity point is, what if you don't have a cell phone? What if you don't have a bank account? You know, a lot of people who are poor don't have either one. And so they're experimenting with kiosks in certain corridors where you know there's a high poverty population, and those folks will have access to the same services through area kiosks. So those are just a few things on the equity point. I think the Smart City Challenge was one of the coolest things we've done. Frankly, we got 78 applications from all over the country, and the whole point of it was to get the country to reimagine transportation. And so now you've got 78 cities that have come up with ideas and plans, and many of them are just going ahead with them. So I like to say that we didn't have any losers in that competition.
Great. Okay, it's your turn. Any questions for Secretary Fox?
Yeah.
I'm going to call on two. I'm going to call Gilles and over here and introduce yourself. And keep your questions tight.
Yeah, Gilles Duranton from the Wharton School. Let me ask a funding question, because as a foreigner, I'm always mesmerized by the way it works in this country. So you have a gas tax that's very, very low, and we could argue whether it should be higher. I mean, I think it should be higher, but then the pot goes on Capitol Hill, and you have some politicians that fight basically to get stuff back into their state, but they also essentially decide to fund particular projects. I view that as just bizarre. So one is a completely different alternative, which is the country I'm coming from. The money actually goes to your peer over there, and essentially there are some engineers below that decide, okay, we're going to allocate the money this year to do this, and that, completely outside of the political process on the day-to-day decisions. An alternative that might be way more suitable to this country would actually be let the gas tax and states do whatever they want, go to the states and let the states will decide whatever they want to do with that money. And if they want to invest a lot in transportation, they can. If they want to invest little, well, they can as well.
So,
okay, go ahead.
Go ahead.
And let him ask his question,
Okay.
and then we'll let you do both.
Thank you. My name is Dan Vack. I'm a reporter with Governing. Getting to your point about smart cities, I just talked to someone from Austin yesterday. He said one of the greatest things about it was that here he was, a city official, talking to all the top people at USDOT. It seems you're a former mayor. There's been a lot of sort of elevation of cities and city departments of transportation. You've even talked about changing the funding on that. How do you sort of continue to get and keep cities in the conversation? I think that's been one of the big focuses of your tenure here.
Thank you. So on the first question, you know, I can't fully explain our political system. Except to say that, you know, we released this report called Beyond Traffic, and the final draft of it came out Monday. And part of what we're trying to do as an agency is to rationalize the data and the facts with decision-making. And that's painful in America because people are used to what they're used to. You know, and I think part of our challenge is that most of our policies and funding have grown up around getting the system built. They haven't necessarily grown up around trying to integrate the system. And that's where we are right now, is we're kind of stuck in build mode as if it's 1956, instead of being in a mode of how do we optimize the freeways, the local streets, the sidewalks, the bike lanes, et cetera. So we've tried to push people towards thinking about that more, and it's an ongoing challenge. On this question, we have worked hard to get local government more involved in what we do. And part of that is because just from a macro economic standpoint, our cities are becoming more of the organizers of our economy. And the regions in which they sit are not just urban, they're suburban, they're rural. And if we can figure out mobility solutions in those regions, we will figure out the nation's transportation system. And so, although I didn't get a whole lot of hearts for the MPO rule that we just put out there, there weren't a lot of love notes sent to us. Part of the reason we did that is because, we're not, in my opinion, going to solve this so-called urban-rural divide in Washington, D.C. We have to deal with that in a region-by-region way. And, pushing neighbors together to problem solve together is actually not a bad thing. It's probably different than what we're used to, but we need to push our regions to plan more collaboratively, not just coordinate, but to plan together.
All right, other questions? Let's go to the two in the back of the room, these glasses and this young man here. Yeah.
Hi, Anson Stewart. I'm a doctoral candidate at MIT. First, thanks for mentioning the cost of doing nothing. I think that really ties into the accessibility point of view. Some of the things we've looked at in Boston include unreliable access to healthcare centers causing late arrivals to missed appointments, like you mentioned. And that has a huge cost kind of from the social point of view. On the previous panel, Secretary Pollack made the observation that given agency culture, shifting to more of an accessibility paradigm may require a lot more kind of advocacy, public participation, and organizing. So given that, and given the fact that kind of new private actors are in many cases starting to control the data that are needed to make some of those arguments, what role could government have in supporting open data standards and open APIs to help enable some of that organizing and participation from the public? Thanks.
Take that one question in the back. I think the gentleman in the glasses right there. Yep. Nope, behind him. Sorry. To the back. Yes, that's two. Fair.
Hi, Keith Bartholomew, University of Utah, and I want to thank the Secretary for his comments this morning and joining us. Referencing also to Secretary Pollack, she noted a linguistic problem, and others have referred to a narrative gap in shifting from mobility talk to accessibility talk. And Secretary Pollack referenced Amory Lovin's excellent quip that people don't care about kilowatts, they care about hot pizza and cold beer. How do we talk about accessibility in something less than a paragraph?
So on both of these points, I think I learned something when I went to Copenhagen. We were there with a group, an architectural firm that gets involved in transportation planning, and whose name escapes me, but they are using a public input model that I think is really interesting, and we're trying to put in place guidance that allows for this. But basically, today our public input process works like, okay, we're going to have a meeting at 4 o'clock at the government center, and everybody show up, and if you show up, you can, look at the maps and comment on them. Now, how well we use that input is really, you leave it to your imagination, but that's the way the public input process works today. What they were showing us were some ways that you can actually go out to where people are already, whether it's a coffee shop or a community meeting that has maybe nothing to do with transportation, and talk about transportation with people in a way that uses their language, not ours. Mm-hmm. And I think that we will see in the near future, not too distant future, not only localities experimenting with more outward ways of seeking public input, but also hopefully some of the states trying to experiment with that. And we've tried to create room in our department to allow for that. I think the public doesn't use the transportation vernacular. And it's really important for us as transportation practitioners to talk to people in the language that they use, not ours. And I think that's an evolution that we are just on the front end of.
We have room for time for one more. Oh, one more. Karen tells me one more.
Okay.
A lot of great questions. Let me do this. Let me do this one. Yeah.
Hi, Secretary. Thank you so much for your time. My name is Emmy Kalawale. I run a human-centered design consultancy. And I was actually wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit to the issue of class as it relates to the evolution of transportation. Usually what ends up happening is everybody loves a great transportation system until suddenly it's in their backyard and they have $1 million house and they don't want anything to really change back there. And I'm curious, how do we navigate the issue of financial influence as we're sort of going into this new phase of our politics and our society?
Yeah, that's one of the, frankly, that's an age-old challenge, and it's not just one of the U.S. I mean, I go across the world, and I see the same thing happening in virtually every part of the world. So I don't think it's an issue that anybody's really figured out, but let me try. I think what I was just saying about public input and using more of an outward inviting kind of public input rather than a closed come to me kind of public input is really important. I think we also have to arm people with the tools to engage, because many communities don't feel as empowered to engage. The community where I'm from, a largely African-American community in the northwest side of the city of Charlotte, every time the transportation department came to them, it was always something bad. And so when folks come today, folks are sitting there thinking, like, what are you going to do to me now? And so we have to be conscious of that and to help people get more comfortable with interfacing with us. And that's one of the reasons why we've actually built a toolkit, a community toolkit, to actually give citizens, regular people, the entire process of getting a project done, where they can engage, what language people are using, so that we kind of demystify it. So that's the public input side. I think the other thing is we've got to pay careful attention to who we elect. When you elect a governor, you're electing the chief transportation official of your state, usually. And where that person's mindset is plays a lot of the role in terms of what happens. Who's on the transportation boards, and making sure that there's adequate representation there and that those voices are at the table is also critical. And that also goes down to the MPOs and down to the local governing bodies as well. So, who's representing you is also part of it too. But largely, I think we're a ground-up system, and if there is low public input, not enough discussion, we're going to get projects that repeat that history. And at the department, I think our tools like Title VI and NEPA need to continue to be robustly applied. I'll say this, with Title VI, as I look back, I think there is a fair amount of, I'm not sure that over the last 50 years, we've thought about Title VI as broadly as I think the writers of Title VI meant it. And for example, can a decision to not do a project be a violation of Title VI? A decision not to hire somebody based on some immutable characteristic can be a Title VII violation. But can a Title VI violation apply to a decision not to do something? In so many cases, there were decisions not to do things. And I happen to believe that can give rise to a Title VI violation under certain circumstances. And so we need to be thinking constantly in our agency about how to promote fairness and to ensure that we're doing the best job we can across the board to build the system our country needs.
So in closing, I want to say that I don't know what you have planned after January 20th, but I think I can speak on behalf of everyone here that we hope you stay in public service.
Thank you.
Your thoughtfulness and passion and common sense approach is what we need, and we hope to see you here on the Brookings stage sometime in the future. Please join me in thanking
Thank you very much.
Secretary.
Thank you.